This week on Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News, we look at a powerful step some adult adoptees are taking to honor their past and present.
What's in a name? Well, for many adoptees, quite a bit.
I just got this download that my name is not Amy.
This week's episode is really important to me. We're going to talk about why I, as a 44-year-old adoptee, have reclaimed my last name.
We'll also hear from another adoptee who made a similar decision. It's a revealing, eye-opening look into stories of adoption. Welcome to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Each week, in a partnership between Denver7 and CPR, we have a real talk about issues impacting underrepresented people across Colorado and amplifying voices you may not always hear. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm CPR's Nathan Fernando-Frescas, a name that honors both my birth and my adoption story. It's a name that better reflects who I am today. And it's a change that I've been thinking about making for many years, and it allows me to hold true to both my birth and my adoption story.
There's very little data available on adult adoptees changing their names, but it's a topic that resonates deeply with many, especially for those trying to reconnect with their origins.
And it's one that's so personal and raw. For some, having their birth name changed once they're adopted feels like their sense of self may have been taken away. For others, there's no connection to that part of their early lives.
Well, Mr. Fernando-Frescas, this brings up many questions, but let's start with this. What is its significance?
The significance of Fernando-Frescas is the name that was given to me when I was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1979, and it's a name that I didn't know for most of my life until 2015 when my adopted mother passed away, and I found in a safety deposit box all of these old yellowing papers of my birth from the state of Texas, and on there was Fernando-Frescas, and that was my name, and also the adoption papers when I changed from Fernando-Frescas to Nathan Heffel, and all of that stuff that went with that. Because again, my adoptive parents are both white. I'm a little brown baby. You can't hide that fact, right? But the deeper story was something I just really came to terms with relatively recently.
I have to ask you, Nathan, how did you feel when you saw Fernando-Frescas? Because that has to be a moment where you just saying it made my heart almost skip a beat. So you being in that moment, looking at these old papers, seeing your name for the first time, how did you feel?
That is such a good question. I'm still processing it. It was joy. It was sadness. It was anger, I think, a little bit, that for so many years I wasn't given the opportunity to learn about my past, my birth past, but also then a little bit of confusion because, I'm a Heffel, right? I was raised in a very loving Wisconsin family, and the traditions and the rituals that the Heffel family has are deeply ingrained in me. But there's this other side of me, this Fernando-Frescas, that is also so important to me. And so it was all of these feelings all at once. And, plus my adopted mother had just passed. So all of that happening, you're clearing out drawers and you're clearing out safety deposit boxes and you're finding things of a whole life. And in that was a huge part of my life that wasn't really shared with me for so long.
Wow. It sounds a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you found much more than just your name. Like most adoptees, you've spent your life wondering about your backstory. What have you discovered through years of searching?
Yeah. And so with the paperwork that I found in 2015 really was the birth of Fernando-Frescas and how my birth mother had me in El Paso, Texas in a hospital. She was middle-aged at the time, and there's a part of the paperwork that's very clinical, that she was quote-unquote ambivalent about the baby, and that she was inebriated at the time of birth, and that she quickly gave up the child. That has stuck with me. I'm imagining it being written by a white doctor at a hospital in El Paso, Texas, and it's very like the mom didn't want the baby. You could clearly read that. But then I'm thinking, and as I've been processing this, maybe my birth mother was distraught because she had a child. Maybe she didn't know what to do. Maybe she was having so many issues that she didn't want to give up the child. All of these things that I'll never know, but I'm having to process in real time.
I think it's really good that you're thinking about what the full context could be around your mother giving birth to you, because what I hear is somebody who is clearly experiencing some sort of trauma in their life that may have nothing at all to do with the baby, but you're having a baby,
Right.
right? And I do think, and I will always think, it is a beautiful, selfless choice to say, my baby can be given a better life by someone other than me
Yeah.
after carrying a baby for 9 months.
And I say in an essay I wrote for CPR.org about that, about choosing the name Fernando-Frescas and how anyone who chooses a name for a child, right, they play it in their mind. They say it out loud. It doesn't roll off the tongue, right? And, I wasn't just baby Frescas, my birth mother did give me a name, Fernando, and she must have played that over and over in her mind. So that is a huge part of this that is sticking with me and really has helped me come to grips with a lot of this.
So Fernando would have been your first name.
Yep.
Wow. Oh,
Yes.
Nathan, that is so beautiful. We're going to continue this conversation. I can't get enough of it. And I just want to say off the top of the show, I appreciate how vulnerable you're being. And I know that your story is going to touch so many people. Coming up, a woman from Louisville who also decided to return to her birth name as an adult. Her film, My Name Is Not Amy, premieres at the Denver Film Festival.
Yeah, it's set against the backdrop of the 2021 Marshall Fire. It's a powerful metaphor for her own journey. Please stay with us. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News.
Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm CPR's Nathan Fernando-Frescas. For 44 years, I've been named Nathan Heffel, a name chosen for me by my adoptive parents when I was given to them shortly after my birth. And recently, I've decided to honor my birth and my adoption story by transitioning to a name that better reflects who I am.
It's a deeply personal decision, one that many adult adoptees may grapple with. And Nathan, you are not alone on this journey.
That's right. Dewi Sungai is a filmmaker based in Louisville and identifies as an indigenous, transracial, and transnational adoptee.
She descends from native Bornean, Banjarese, Sundanese, and English ancestors. But she didn't know most of her birth story, including her birth name, until a few years ago.
Yeah. Her new documentary, My Name Is Not Amy, explores this identity journey and premieres at the Denver Film Festival.
I think it's a very common experience for adoptees, and specifically transracial adoptees, to come into white families and white communities that tell you stories as you're growing up that are not entirely accurate, and in some cases are very harmful. These are stories they tell you about yourself, about them, and the world.
Dewi joins us now. Dewi, thank you so much for being with us here for this Real Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you were adopted in 1978 by two white parents. That's the year before I was adopted. Tell me about that and how your parents treated you as their adoptive child.
So I was born to a young Indonesian birth mother. She was single, she was in school at the time, and didn't realize she was pregnant until she was about 5 months along. So she did not have a lot of time to adjust to this new life situation. She was able to find a midwife to work with her privately. I was a secret from her family, which is a very proud Muslim family. And she had exams coming up when she was around 7 months. And the midwife said, come by on Friday. I will give you a pill to start labor. And within 24 hours, I was born. 2 days later, she was returning to university. So I was a preemie like you. And I assume spent the first few weeks of my life in some kind of incubator in this woman's apartment. Yep. And then there's a connection to the United States Embassy in Jakarta. Somebody there knew about my parents, who my dad was a geographer and doing work in Jakarta at the time. They'd been looking to adopt and bring home a baby Asian girl and heard about me and then sure enough, stars aligned. And one night they came and picked me up, and that was it.
My eyes are wide because that is such an incredible story. You always knew you were adopted, but you said you discovered more about your ancestral roots much later. How did that come to be?
Yeah, so I always knew that I was born from an Indonesian woman and that my birth father was English. I didn't start asking deep questions about my ancestors until the pandemic. So
2020.
2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an interesting year for so many of us. Summer 2020 was huge for me with the Black Lives Matter uprising because I had been adopted into, raised in white suburban America, and suddenly this young man, Ahmaud Arbery, is shot for running down the street in white suburbia. That made me start to question what has always felt a little wrong about living in white suburbia to me, and also ask really hard questions. Why don't I get shot at when I'm running down the street? These very big uprisings and racial justice conversations started to hit on a personal level that I hadn't experienced before. And I kind of had this moment where I was like, oh, yeah, who am I? Where do I come from? How did I get here? Really, what I call the coming out of the fog experience as an adoptee. I've always felt very indigenous, which makes no sense when you think about how far away I am from my homeland and, you know, the kind of culture and community that I'm being raised in. But as part of that, ceremony has always been a really important part of my life. I was in ceremony with my husband at sometime in 2020 to early 2021, and I just got this download that my name is not Amy. So I got in touch with my birth mother, who I've been in touch with since my 20s. I asked her, did you name me at birth? And she emailed back and said, yes, Dewi. It was just this rush of feeling this reunion with a part of myself. And I think I even mispronounced it when I first saw the name because with my American brain, I was like, oh, Dewey. And then I had to go to some Dutch name pronunciation website, which is funny, to understand that the Indonesian E sounds like an A.
Well, and your film, My Name Is Not Amy, really explores that connection. And it is backed by a very powerful metaphor of the Marshall Fire that ravaged your community that you were living in. And I want to play a clip kind of that sets that up for us.
I was angry that this community that adopted me and raised me and named me and sculpted me have been telling me the wrong story all this time. And then it all burned down.
So why is the fire connected to your decision?
I'm so glad you're asking that question because it's not an overt statement in the film. I think it's one that I'm happy to let viewers interpret for themselves. Looking back at the reality of what was unfolding during that time, we were about a year and a half into making this film. About coming back to my Indonesian identity, and specifically my native Bornean identity. I was experiencing a lot of anger at what I will call the myths that I was raised to believe. And so in a very personal way, I felt this fire raging inside of me. Then the Marshall Fire happened. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is like this physical manifestation of what I've been experiencing personally in my own breaking from whiteness and coming into my own Indigenous identity. Also, as an Indigenous person, I couldn't help but see that fire as a sovereign spirit that came through with a message for all of us. And for me in my story, there are these myths, again, that I've been raised with that needed to burn down inside of me to understand my truth, the truth of the land I live on, the truth of what happened to the land I live on, the truth of my privilege.
Well, and in the film, there is a montage of adult adoptees just talking back and forth. And I wanted to play a clip of that.
They basically told adoptive parents to be colorblind, to not focus on culture.
You're our Korean princess, you're our Korean daughter. They were holding me up to prove to other people that they're not racist.
They moved into a community when they retired that would regularly stop me and ask what I was doing there.
Love is enough. Yeah, just raise him like he's white.
There's kind of this moment of like, right, I'm not white.
What does that exemplify? All of these different voices saying similar things and that feeling as you are with your adoptive parents who love you, but there is that sense of something deeper hidden inside.
It was very important for me to bring in the community on this one because it's not just one story. I mean, our stories could fill the air for years and they are worthy enough to do so. And it's a short film, so you're just scratching the surface. But the pieces that I chose to include are pieces where personally I was like, oh my gosh, like the same words could come out of my mouth if you asked me that question.
Well, Dewi, we have a lot more to dive into. Dewi Sungai is a filmmaker based in Louisville. Her film, My Name Is Not Amy, premieres Wednesday the 6th during the Denver Film Festival. Dewi, stick around. We have more to talk about.
We're going to have a conversation about our name, reclaiming our name. So stick with us. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News.
Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando-Frescas. I recently changed my name to reflect both my adoptive story and my birth heritage. My name was Nathan Heffel, given to me by my adoptive parents when they adopted me. But as I discovered a few years ago, I was born Fernando-Frescas.
It's a story so many adoptees around Colorado and the country share, and it's the focus of our episode this week. Dewi Sungai is with us again, and as your film explores the truth of your birth story, any birth story is so personal, Dewi.
How does that feel, having that film now in the world that is so intimate to you, but also is the story of so many other adoptees?
It feels good. I feel like personally, this is very important narrative correction for myself. I think as adoptees, and especially transracial and transnational adoptees, we are brought into families that have their own story about us and have their own version of the origin story of how we became a family. And then there's truth in it, right? But there's a reclaiming that has happened for myself and that I wish for all adoptees about the truth of, again, who we are, where we come from, how we got here.
There is this sense, and you've mentioned this, coming out of the fog. But for me, coming out of this fog, there's not anger, but perhaps if my adoptive parents were still alive, there may be some of that anger. Why didn't you share this with me earlier? I didn't ask a lot of questions because I did have that privilege of being a Heffel and all that came with that. I didn't pursue finding that info. But again, on the other side, my adoptive parents didn't share that info. It's holding me back a little bit from being angry. But again, I'm only, a couple weeks into this. You've had a few years.
Yeah, yes. And, things were building up my whole life. When I look back on some of the patterns of my relationship with my adoptive parents, the flare-ups that we had 3 years ago when I was coming out of the fog weren't necessarily new. I just had a little more context to them. I could articulate them as an adult. I could look to other transracial adoptee stories and see the parallels. Again, there's this pattern, the dynamics that are a part of a system. It's bigger than our family. It's bigger than my one birth story. It's part of a system.
With that said, with this system, as I'm now coming into understanding a bit more about Fernando-Frescas and that side of my life, there's going to be missteps. But I can't tell you, after I've come forward with this story, how many people have emailed me and told me their stories and also offered, hey, let's grab coffee. I want to talk to you about my history. I want to talk about, how you fit into Hispanic culture, Latino culture, right? And how that is, for me, kind of scary. I don't know Spanish. I don't know anything about my culture. And so there's a sense of like, well, I'm not right here, but I'm also not right here, but I'm trying. I mean, did you have a similar feeling when you came to that decision to revert back to that name?
Yeah, so this idea of belonging is a very interesting experience that we have as adoptees, and again, especially transracial, transnational adoptees. I have gone back to Indonesia. I have gone back knowing my birth name And I remember this one time I went to a Starbucks. They asked for my name to write on the cup. I said, Dewi. They couldn't understand what I was saying. I had to type it out on my phone and hold it up and show them. And then they were like, oh, and then they looked at me sideways the whole time like, you couldn't possibly have an Indonesian name. It's a very common Indonesian name. And I'm mixed race, so I don't people don't necessarily look at me and say, oh, you're Indonesian, aren't you? There's this struggle to feel like you don't belong or I'm not Indonesian enough. I'm not brown enough. And I think that's just part of our journey.
I just want to thank both of you for this conversation. It's opened my eyes a lot. When we say what's in a name, we know a lot is in a name. To be honest, as a Black American, I am very proud of my first name. My first name was intentionally set. It was well thought out. My last name is Smith, the most generic last name in the United States. But I don't really want to know the origins because I think as a Black American, we know names like Smith, Williams, Johnson almost always leads back to enslavement in one form or another. But having this conversation with you all now does have me a little bit more curious to learn exactly where my last name came from. Even though I know it likely carries some pain, it is a part of me and my story.
I mean, you drive anywhere around this area and you look at the street signs and there are these names that we're all familiar with, but we don't really understand the story behind them. It's everywhere. This name story, yes, it's a very unique adoption story, but it's kind of something that affects all of us. And when I talk about narrative correction in my own life, what are the narratives we need to correct all over the country, all over the world? Nathan, I think something you're going to find as you continue to share your story is that there's so much intersectionality with so many people who did not experience adoption. It's one starting point, and it grows to encapsulate so many of us.
And it's so interesting. I'm already finding that. Emails from people, messages from people saying, I'm not adopted, but.
Yeah.
I know my birth mother, but. And you've mentioned to me just how stories are so organic and they, we all have a story, but they all intersect, they all intertwine, and how everything is so connected in that way that we don't even know.
But you guys are cool. I'm going to keep complimenting you. You guys are cool because you did have a certain level of privilege that you decided to reject and really step into who you are. But to do that, you have to reject part of your privilege, and part of the privilege is not knowing. And both of your stories are so beautiful, and even though they're similar, they're different. And I think so many people that hear this episode of Real Talk are going to be inspired to do that introspection and really look at that piece that's missing. It's easy to turn away from the piece that's missing. But when you turn toward it, you find things that you never thought you would. And hearing that from both of you sounds like it's an incredible thing.
Yeah.
Dewi, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
And that's this week's episode of Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Every week, we have a Real Talk on issues that impact underrepresented Coloradans who are often overlooked.
You can find all of our shows on denver7.com/realtalk or at cpr.org/realtalk. Have a great day.